Hello and welcome. I'm G. Geronimo and this is Rappler Talk. Today we're talking to Dr. Mario Aurelio, Professor Geologist and Director of the National Institute for Geological Sciences at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Hello, sir. Welcome to Rappler.
Yes, good afternoon. Good rainy afternoon.
Sir, we're going to talk today about earthquakes, and recently we just experienced strong earthquakes, the 6.1 magnitude earthquake in Luzon and also the twin earthquakes in Batanes. Sir, in fact, you did a study on the Luzon earthquake. Can
That's
you
right.
talk about that? What did your study show?
Okay, so we call it the Zambales earthquake, although others call it the Castillejos earthquake, or more generally, Northern Luzon earthquake of 2019. The Zambales earthquake struck a region which is located, if I think people are more familiar with Mount Pinatubo, right? So the area that was hit by that earthquake is around Mount Pinatubo. The regions covered would be, well, the provinces covered are Zambales, Pangasinan, and Pampanga, and Bataan, by the way. So that earthquake occurred in a place where nobody was expecting an earthquake would take place, because as of that date, that was April 22, by the way, 2019, existing active fault maps of the mandated agency of government, which is the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, did not indicate any traces of an active fault in that area. So therefore, because the general association is that for an earthquake to occur, there has to be an active fault that will generate the earthquake.
Right.
But in that case, in Zambales, in April 22, there is no known fault in that area. Well, this is not the first time that an earthquake takes place in an area where there are no known active faults. In fact, if you remember, in 2012 and 2013, there were two earthquakes in the Visayas, namely Negros earthquake of 2012 February and the Bohol earthquake of 2013, which were both of strong magnitude, 6.7 for Negros, 7.2 for Bohol, also took place in areas where there were no known active faults. So my point is, it is not a surprise if an earthquake takes place, even in an area where there are no known active faults. But however, it is a concern because, as I said, the general association, especially for the general public, is that for an earthquake to occur, there has to be an active fault.
Yes.
Okay, so that's one sort of salient feature of that Zambales earthquake. The second feature is that the magnitude was not really that strong. It's 6.1. The earthquake in Bohol was 33 times stronger, meaning order of magnitude higher, 7.2. But in the Zambales earthquake, even if the magnitude was not that strong, the infrastructure damage was still significant in the general vicinity, and in particular in Pampanga, especially in areas which were covered and are still being covered by lahar of Pinatubo, which erupted in 1991. So I'm speaking of places like Porac in Pampanga, Florida Blanca, Bacolor, which were affected by a phenomenon called liquefaction. Liquefaction is the process by which the ground, which is usually sandy in nature, turns into or starts behaving like a liquid, and therefore loses its strength. So any structure built on it would suffer infrastructure damage, like collapse or even only cracks on buildings. So that's the main reason why the infrastructure damage in that area was relatively strong or significant. Otherwise, magnitude-wise, the 6.1 magnitude should not have actually produced such degree of damage. If you're familiar with the situation on the western side of Pinatubo, which is Zambales, Castillejos, there were no significant infrastructure damage because that part is not underlain by lahar.
Lahar.
Yeah, so it was really the lahar, poor integrity of the lahar material, which really was the culprit in the damage. Okay, and maybe the third thing that I can mention about that earthquake is that I mentioned a while ago that it happened in the vicinity of Mount Pinatubo. Now, in the study of earthquakes and volcanoes, very often, whenever they are close to each other, there is a possibility that one interacts with the other.
Okay.
Meaning that if a fault moves and causes an earthquake, but that fault is very close to or maybe directly underneath a volcano, then it is possible, I'm not saying that this is what has happened in Zambales, but it is possible that the pressure that was released during the earthquake could generate or could increase the pressure underneath the volcano, meaning in the magma chamber.
Okay.
And what does it mean by increasing the pressure or the stresses in the magma chamber? It means that you will increase the mobility of the magma and therefore maybe induce an eruption. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but it's part of our study.
Right.
In 1990, if you remember, the strongest so far in the last maybe 50 years,
Yes.
July 16 was the big earthquake of central Luzon. Cabanatuan was the epicenter. The magnitude then was 7.8. Now, if you remember, a year later, actually less than a year later, I don't know if you are that young or old to have remembered that Pinatubo erupted on June 13, 1991. So less than a year after. Pinatubo is not too far away from Cabanatuan. It's about 75 kilometers apart. But there are studies that sort of associate, but that not directly linked, but sort of associate that earthquake with the eruption of Pinatubo. Now, it's not only that case in the Philippines where this possible association of an fault rupturing to cause an earthquake and succeeded by a volcanic eruption. In many other places in the world, like in Italy, in New Zealand, where we see similar settings, meaning there are faults close by volcanoes, there are quite a lot of studies that show a more direct link between the occurrence of an earthquake and succeeded by a volcanic eruption, actually. So that's perhaps the third thing that is some sort of salient in the case of the Zambales earthquake.
Are you closely monitoring that association between?
Yeah, well, first and foremost is we have to model it, meaning do some calculations. They're technically mathematical in nature, but what we want to see is if the stresses that were released during the earthquake are strong enough, that's one, and they are close enough to the magma chamber to increase the pressure in that magma chamber. To monitor it would be to observe the volcano itself, put instrumentation in there, and that's what PHIVOLCS is doing, by the way. So it is certainly more appropriate for PHIVOLCS, of course, to speak of this
Yes,
monitoring activity.
But your study is still ongoing as of there.
We are in the writing stage now. So.
And you're going to present it to PHIVOLCS, or you're working
No,
closely
we are going to present it in an international conference in December in San Francisco, in the US. Yeah. And submit it to a journal. That's the life of a scientist.
Sir, just to go back to, you mentioned again the places where the infra was significant, the damage was significant, and of course we know that Pampanga was hardest hit.
Yeah.
Sir, can you talk more about that, specifically in Porac, because that's where most of the casualties were.
Yeah, well, if I remember right, based at least on media reports, the most number of deaths was recorded in that commercial building which collapsed in the town of Porac. Actually, so we visited, my team visited together with myself, visited that building itself. In fact, it is not the only building of that height, because beside it there was another building almost the same. It's a 4-story building, 3-story building. I can't remember anymore. But the building of the same height beside it uh, did not suffer any significant damage. So there was an issue, and still I think it remains an issue if the collapse of that building was not also the result of poor engineering. So not only because of the natural process of liquefaction, but also perhaps there was something missing or wrong in the design. I'm not a structural engineer, but I heard that when we were there, it was about the same time that the Secretary of the Department of Public Works, Mark Villar, was also there. And right there and then, I think he held a press conference saying that he would convene a team to investigate the case. I'm not any more familiar with what happened to the investigation, but certainly they should, by now, they should have a report on investigation. Yeah, for the other places, like not only in Porac but as far east as Bacolor in Pampanga, where liquefaction was extensive. Again, it's because of the very thick deposits of sandy material due to the lahar in 1991. But although since there are less important structures, only residential. Well, of course, residential buildings are also very important. But in terms of the cost of the damage, it would be less compared to a commercial building that collapses.
Right. Sir, you wrote also in May, after the Luzon earthquake, that almost anywhere in the Philippines, because of what happened, a destructive earthquake is bound to happen anytime.
That's right.
Can you expound further on
Yeah,
that?
well, if you don't mind, let's go back a bit to
Sure.
Plate Tectonics 101, which we learn in Earth Science as early as senior high school now with the K-12 program. The Earth is made up of different plates, and these plates are moving against each other. Not in all places, these plates are very mobile, but in the Philippines, these plates are very mobile. I don't know if we call ourselves unlucky in that sense, but for geoscientists like me, we are lucky because there are things that we can study. But because of the very the activity of these plates, then we experience earthquakes. In the Philippines, we have at least 3 of these plates and at least 6 or 7 boundaries in between them. So when you say boundary, it's that interface between 2 plates that when they slide past each other, you have a fault and therefore you experience an earthquake. So in the Philippines, we have at least 6 of those. But then there's one place in the Philippines where it's relatively stable. I'm not saying that it's absolutely stable, but it's relatively stable. That's in Palawan, Central and South Palawan. When I say Central, that would be south of Puerto Princesa, all the way down to Balabac Island. Otherwise, anywhere in the Philippines, it is earthquake prone. So that's one reason why, that's one of the main reasons why FIVOLCS exists, because they are mandated to study all these active faults, and they are supposed to map all these active faults for the general public to know. And why do we have to know where they are? Because they are the generators of earthquakes anytime, anywhere. So the key really is to know where they are, and so therefore we can properly, appropriately design whatever infrastructure we want to build. In fact, there is it is required that if in a certain area a fault has been identified by FIVOLCS, it is not supposed to be, there should be no permanent structures built on that area. You can develop it into some sort of a park, but there should be no permanent dwelling, for example, residence, house, or condominium commercial areas.
Yeah. What happens, sir, if you belatedly learn about the...
That's what's happening, actually.
Right.
Because what has happened in the last, shall we say, 50 or so years is that Metro Manila developed very quickly, subdivisions everywhere, villages everywhere, condominiums everywhere, without, I would say, consciousness on the presence of faults,
Right.
especially that fault called the Valley Fault System, which has two branches. The one is the West Valley Fault. We are not too far away from that, in this building, by the way, and the East Valley Fault in Antipolo. So, but the government, through FIVOLCS, is trying its best actually to update that fault map for public consumption, for everybody to know where the faults are. So if a structure has already been built over a fault that was belatedly discovered, then, well, you have several options. Either you vacate, which is the simplest but most difficult to do,
Right,
because
right.
there are decisions to make, there are considerations to make before you make the decision to leave. Or otherwise, strengthen your structures, what they call retrofitting.
Retrofitting.
Yeah, retrofitting. So there are other ways, but this would be already on the engineering interventions,
Right.
which is not anymore the concern of a geologist like me.
Sir, but are there areas that are more vulnerable to earthquakes
Yes.
than other places?
Yes. As I said, the faults so far that have been identified in those areas where these faults have already been identified, that those would be the more vulnerable places. And places like farther away from those faults would be less vulnerable. But the vulnerability is actually relative to the distance of the identified fault. So it is not zero vulnerability, but less. For example, let's take the case of Ortigas area where we are now, which I mentioned a while ago, is not too far away from the West Valley Fault, compared to a place somewhere in downtown Manila, which is far away from the West Valley Fault. So the vulnerability for ground shaking of that area in Metro Manila would be less than in Ortigas. However, there's another factor, which is the nature of the ground underneath. The nature of the ground underneath Ortigas is more competent than the ground in downtown Manila, because it's an estuary. It's the end of the Pasig River, and therefore the material there would be sandy, not compacted, as compared to the material underneath Ortigas, which is volcanic ash, but compacted. We call adobe. It's in common terms, it's adobe. We call it tuff, actually, volcanic tuff. So there are many factors that
So you don't just
play.
look at the fault,
That's
you
right.
also look at the structure.
exactly the
composition,
nature,
right.
the nature of the subsurface.
Right,
We call
right.
it. Yeah.
Right.
So there are a lot of other factors.
Sir, you mentioned the 1990 Luzon earthquake earlier,
Yes.
and we know that it was really a deadly earthquake. Let's talk about what's really deadly about earthquakes. We know that it's not just the moving, but the effects after the earthquake.
Yes, of course, when a structure is right underneath a fault, then you can expect the worst of damages to happen, meaning breakage of even concrete and everything. So that until now has no solution. The only solution is to move away from that fault. Now, when an earthquake occurs, so long as if you are in the building that is directly underneath, that is built directly over a fault, then certainly it can physically affect you, meaning if you are living in that house, then the house can collapse. However, let's say a community or population is located away from a fault, but still if the fault moves and produces an earthquake, it is no assurance that you are located away from a fault, because in fact there's still the effect of, as I said a while ago, ground shaking, and therefore your building can still sway.
Right.
And if you are living in, say, 30-40-story building, then that swaying can cause damage or even panic to the occupants, and stampede can sometimes also cause death. So that's one. But the approach now, well, what we are trying to advocate really is to prepare by way of knowing what the potential hazards of that earthquake can produce. Like for example, if an earthquake along the West Valley Fault produces an earthquake of produces magnitude of about say 7.2, that's the current model of FIVOLs right now, then there are ways to calculate how strong the ground will shake.
Okay.
So if you are able to calculate how strong the ground will shake, the engineers will now know how to construct a building that can resist that shaking. And therefore, it will be part of the ground and not anymore it will not move in accordance with the swaying of the ground. And that reduces the chances of that building to collapse. But without knowing those estimations or calculations, then there's really no way of making sure that the building will resist the earthquake. So that's one. Second is very simply knowing what is underneath the ground, meaning the material in the ground. So if you are deciding to construct a building, let's say in downtown Manila, make sure that the material underneath will hold your building depending on how tall you want your building to be.
Yes.
So normally what is done is you excavate the poor material and then replace it with more sturdy material.
So you can do that, sir?
Yeah, there are engineering approaches actually to sort of address this problem of poor subsurface materials.
Right. Right. So there are options like this.
Yes, but they become more expensive, of course. Yeah.
But what if you decide to do that, sir, but the other areas are not replaced?
Okay, that is their problem. So basically, yes, the information should be for everybody, really. So it's not for anyone only who wishes to construct a building. It should be for everybody. I remember sometime in the mid-90s, I think that was 1995, there was a case in Binondo where a building collapsed. There was no earthquake at all, but there was a building that collapsed. Allegedly because there was a construction ongoing beside it, and they were digging piles. There's a practice in engineering where in order to anchor your building, you have to first dig piles, some sort of stilts. But while you do that, you are causing actually artificial ground shaking. Earthquake. And allegedly, I don't know what happened to the investigation, but allegedly that was one of the reasons why that building beside collapsed. So you see, the point is, as you asked a while ago, what happens to the surroundings?
Right.
If I make sure that in my territory I'm safe, but in the vicinity, they'll have to know what I have done in the building that I constructed to make it safe all throughout. So it should be for everybody. Yes. Yeah.
Sir, what about secondary hazards?
Yes.
After earthquake, we can talk about landslides.
That's right.
Earlier, you also talked about liquefaction, and then
That's
also
right.
tsunami.
Yeah. Yes. Actually, in the Zambales earthquake, I have not mentioned this a while ago. In the Zambales earthquake, aside from the liquefaction that was very widespread in the hard deposits in Pampanga, particularly in Pampanga, there were also landslides on the flanks of Pinatubo volcano. Also in the towns of Florida Blanca, but in the uphill side, as well as in Porac. But these are not anymore in the lowland areas. They were in the flanks of the volcano, so there were landslides. These landslides were triggered actually by the shaking of the ground when after the earthquake struck the place. So it's a secondary phenomenon. It is not a direct result actually of the rupturing of the fault, but it's a consequence of the shaking of the ground over hilly or steep slopes that are already actually inherently unstable because of the steepness of the slopes. So you only need a trigger. In the Philippines, there are two types of triggers. One is earthquakes. The other one is rains, heavy rains. So, but in the case in Porac and in Florida Blanca, it was the shaking of the ground due to the earthquake that caused the landslides. And very unfortunate, what is unfortunate in this case is that the areas that were affected by landslides were the housing villages of the indigenous people, the Aitas. Yeah. And as far as I have been told by one of my students who did the survey there, about 200 houses or even more in one village actually were unlivable after the landslides.
Right.
They collapsed. They were made of light material, but still, because of the strong ground shaking, their dwellings were damaged. The damage in their dwellings were very intense. Yes, yeah. So that's a secondary. Now, as far as tsunamis are concerned, tsunamis only occur when the epicenter is offshore, meaning in the ocean. Over water, underwater. And it happens only in a type of earthquake or in a type of earthquake where the fault causes the ground to move vertically. Not all faults move the ground vertically. Some cause the ground to move horizontally, like the one in Zambales, by the way. So when an earthquake of that type occurs, then what happens to the seabed? Remember I mentioned that the sources to come from the offshore area. What happens then is that the seabed, because the movement is vertical, moves up or down, and the water column above would move up or down. It depends on how the seabed moved during the earthquake. The change or the reaction of the water to move up or down will now cause, will be translated in the form of waves on the surface. And as they travel from the source to the shores, the seabed or the water column actually becomes more shallow, but the water volume will be the same.
Right.
So that what brings the waves taller as they come to the shore, and that is tsunami.
Right.
Yeah. So the requirement is for tsunami to occur, there has to be an earthquake that will be produced by a fault that will allow the ground to move vertically. Yeah. We call them thrust faults or normal faults.
Do we experience?
Yes, in the Philippines, we are surrounded by, as I mentioned a while ago, 6 subduction trenches, which allow the seabed to move up and down when an earthquake occurs.
But they're not strong enough to be.
Well, not yet.
Not hopefully.
But there is potential. If you look at the tsunami-prone areas map of the Philippines by FIVOLCS, all the coastal towns in the east and in the west of the Philippines are all tsunami-prone areas. And the other point of concern, actually, as far as tsunami is concerned in the Philippines, is that there is no lead time. There's not much lead time between the generation of the earthquake and the arrival of the tall waves. There's only some in between 10 to 15 minutes for the case of Philippine generators. But if you remember, there was an earthquake in Indonesia, in Aceh, 2005, generated a tsunami that reached as far as Africa and still caused actually significant damage there and even deaths in Africa. It traveled about 8 hours, so there was supposedly time to prepare. But in the Philippines, there are only a matter of a few tens of minutes lead time. So it's challenging, but what FIVOLCS has been doing is to mark out these places. For example, if you've been to Baler, there's a monument there in Baler saying that this was struck by a tsunami sometime in the 1700s, 1745, meaning that area can experience again a tsunami. And also at the Philippines, in the eastern and western coast, there are markers. There are supposed to be markers. For us geologists, we know where those places would be, but of course the general public has to be made known also, be informed about where these places are. Basically, it's in the coastal areas, in the West Philippine Sea, Sulu Sea, Cotabato, that's Celebesi, and then in the eastern side, many call it the Pacific Ocean, but it's the Philippine Sea really on that side. So I'm speaking of say places like Casiguran, Isabela, down to the Bicol Peninsula, Caramoan, Catanduanes, Surigao, yeah, all the way. The surf areas actually are tsunami prone in Siargao.
Right, right. So these areas should also prepare, part of their earthquake drills should also be to prepare for
Yes,
tsunami.
in fact, luckily in many of these places, even in the tourist areas, for example, in Siargao, you can see from time to time markers. This is a tsunami-prone area, and then there would be instructions on where to go in case a tsunami occurs. Well, the technique really there is just go to a higher elevation area. The tsunami can only reach a certain height, let's say 2 meters, depending again on the models that have been generated using the generators of Philippine earthquakes. For example, I think in eastern Mindanao, the waves can only reach something like 3 or 4 meters. And so if a tsunami strikes, then simply look for a place where it is above 3 meters, or 5 meters.
So there's a way, sir, to know how high it could reach.
Yes, there are calculations.
Right.
You can make there are a lot of studies actually, even locally, internationally. There are a lot of studies to predict the height of the potential tsunami that can reach the shores. Of course, it's not only the height; it's also the speed of the water that's coming in, and the backlash. Actually, the tsunami does not only the damage that can be caused by tsunami is not only because of the arrival, but also on the return
when it returns.
Yeah. And during the Aceh earthquake, actually, many of the other damage was because of the return of the waves. Many thought that it was already done, finished, but actually it came down back.
And then it Okay. Sir, let's talk about the big one, the magnitude 7.2 earthquake that could hit Metro Manila if the West
Should
Valley
have happened
falls.
yesterday, actually.
Sir, aside from the earthquake drills that we conduct on a regular basis, what do you think should we do on the short term, also in the long term, to prepare for this?
Yeah, partly I've already mentioned some of them. Be aware of where the faults are relative to where you live, where you work, where you frequent, places where you frequent, like I don't know, gig areas and malls and things like this. That's one. And to know that, you'll have to consult the documents that are being prepared by the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, because after all, they are the mandated agency to produce these documents. So those documents are simply showing, these are maps simply showing where the faults are. And in fact, they're available over in the website. You can download those maps, and if you know where your house is located, actually you can pinpoint if you are right under a fault or above a fault or maybe a little distance from them. That's one. But the other thing is it is not very popular, meaning this recommendation might not necessarily be accepted by everybody, is before you start constructing your residence, your house, whether it's single story, 2 stories, 3 stories, consult an expert, meaning someone who knows about faults and someone who knows how to address concerns about faults, meaning the engineer. The geologist is the first and the engineer is the next. Many think it's costly, it's expensive, but what is expensive if it's life-threatening, right? So it's some sort of insurance. In Western countries, in the US, Taiwan, Japan, some other, New Zealand, they insure their property from earthquakes already. So there's insurance for earthquakes. I have heard of some properties in the Philippines that are insured for earthquakes already, but not everybody. As I said, maybe it's not yet a popular choice to insure your property from earthquakes. So that's a long-term, preparation. Yeah. You were speaking of the big one that has not happened yet. It has been called the big one for the last 20 or 30 years. But this has not taken place yet. The belief is that, not everybody thinks so, but the belief is that an earthquake should have already happened of this magnitude even some 50 years ago.
Really?
The reason being that there was a study, or there have been several studies, saying that the West Valley Fault has already caused some 4 earthquakes in the last 1,500 years. So if you do the simple math, you divide 1,500 by 4 times, that's about 375 years.
Right.
Meaning the interval in between big earthquakes is about 375 years. Okay. You're not concerned, I'm not concerned, because I cannot live that long, right? 375 years. But then, like in any scientific method, there's an error, the margin of error.
Right, right.
And the margin of error is 200 years.
Oh, okay.
So, it's either 375 minus 200, which is 175, or 375 plus 200, which is 575.
Yes.
Okay, so the next question is, when was the last one? Right? So, if you are worried today and in the near future, when will that be? Right? To know that, you'll have to go back in time and determine when was the last one. According to the records of Volks, it was sometime in the 1680, around that time, which is already about 370 something years ago.
Right.
So if,
We're already in the margin of
that's
error.
right. In fact, if we take what we call the more conservative number, it would be 175 years, right? 375 minus 200.
Right.
That means that it should have already happened some 200 years ago, but it has not happened yet.
Right.
Maybe we are in the margin of error, period. But we cannot take the risk of waiting for it just so we'll be satisfied that it really will happen. So what we need to do is to prepare. That's what everybody has been advocating, at least from our side, is to prepare.
Right.
Meaning not only prepare when the earthquake has already struck, meaning go underneath the table and things like this. I think we've been doing quite good in terms of the earthquake drills.
Yes.
But really preparing beforehand, meaning be aware where the faults are, and then designing properly your infrastructure. And you might have noticed around Metro Manila in the last 5 years or so, the DPWH has been retrofitting many of the infrastructure. The flyover from EDSA going to Ortigas, there was a point in time some 2-3 years ago that the pillars of the flyover were actually thinner in diameter, but they are now thicker. They've been retrofitted. So many of especially the flyovers, the elevated highways are being retrofitted. Hopefully, of course, the retrofitting designs are appropriate, meaning they've been designed according to the expected magnitude. That's the other thing, by the way. When you make a decision to design an infrastructure so that it becomes earthquake resilient, not really earthquake proof, but earthquake resilient, meaning it can sustain damage given a certain magnitude, then it's all a very big component of that prediction actually is the magnitude. So how do you predict the magnitude? The magnitude has something to do with many things, but one of them would be the length of the fault. So in general, the longer the fault, the higher the magnitude. The shorter the fault, the lower the magnitude. And there are a lot of available equations to use. And so if we take a look at the West Valley Fault, some say it's about 120 kilometers long. Others say it's about only 90 kilometers long. So it comes off from Bulacan, Del Monte, down to Tagaytay. So that's about 100 kilometers long. And if you take that length and take the worst case scenario, meaning the equation that produces the highest magnitude, then it gives something like 7.2 or 7.5.
Right.
So that's where actually the value of 7.2 comes
7.2.
from. It's
Right.
because of the length of the fault. The Bohol earthquake was 7.2. The North Bohol earthquake in 2013, the magnitude then recorded was 7.2. And so it's a similar, if the earthquake in Metro Manila takes place, the damage would be as strong as what happened in Bohol. So in Bohol, what happened in Bohol? Almost all the heritage churches collapsed.
Yes.
Different degrees of collapse, but the most devastated was the Church of Loon in the western Bohol. It totally collapsed in rubbles.
Right.
Okay, so that can happen in a similar structure built in, say, Intramuros or downtown Manila, of the same age, of the same architecture, of the same building design and everything. So that can also happen. Yeah. So there is also an effort now as far as retrofitting these old churches in the Philippines, especially in Metro Manila, and yeah, the
And even
Manila
schools,
Cathedral,
right?
and even schools.
Right.
There's one school that some 2-3 years ago, I think the grade school schedule was delayed because they were retrofitting the buildings.
the
Ateneo
buildings,
Ateneo
right,
Grade
right,
School.
right.
Yeah, one of the buildings there is built right on one of the branches of the West Valley Fault.
Of the fault.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So the FIVOX recently came out actually with an app that shows us the hazards in a
Can I
particular
drink my
area.
coffee?
Sure, of course. Sir, if I want to know the hazards in my home or in my workplace, what specific hazards should I look out for?
Yes. Okay. It's not. FIVOLC says it's not yet. The categories cannot be categorized yet as an app, but because actually it's a link, it's a website link for now. But what does that do? I'm trying to look for it now. It it starts off with a map of the Philippines, and then you can zoom into it. It's a Google Earth map actually. You can zoom into it and look for a place of interest, area of interest. For example, your house, your residence, or your workplace, your school, and then click on it. If you double click on it, a summary will come out somewhere in the window of your either laptop or cell phone that will enumerate the hazards
In that
that
area.
your area might be susceptible to. There are basically 3 or 4 if you dissect the other one. So one is how far away. So this is let's take a particular case, Metro Manila. How far away are you from an active fault? So for example, if you click this place, then it would give you the distance to the West Valley Fault in meters or in kilometers. Next, it also gives you how far or how close you are to the nearest active volcano. So in Metro Manila, the nearest is Taal. Remember, active volcano. There are other volcanoes,
Right.
but the closest active volcano to Metro Manila is Taal. Depending if you are somewhere in Bulacan, then it would be Pinatubo. If you are somewhere in the south, let's say Taguig or Canlubang, it would be Taal. And then the 2 others would be how far away are you from landslide-prone areas. For example, Antipolo, if you were somewhere in Antipolo, it would indicate which areas are, how far away are you from the landslide-prone areas. And the other one is how far or how close are you from flood-prone areas. So you see, after looking at those 4 hazards, you cannot find any place in the Philippines
That
where
is not close to any of this.
that is not close to all 4.
Yes.
There will always be at least one
At
of
least
them.
one or
And really, you can find a place where all the 4, maybe not all the 4, at least 3, all 3 of them meaning close to a fault, close to a volcano, close to a flood-prone area.
Yeah.
In general, flood-prone areas are far away from landslide-prone areas, because the flood-prone areas would be the lowlands, the
Right.
low-lying areas, and the landslide-prone areas would be the steep mountainous
Mountainous
regions.
areas. Right.
So closest to Metro Manila would be the Antipolo Range, Montalban, um, somewhere in Binangonan, yeah, those areas.
Okay.
That's that. It's being developed by a very young team of geologists, computer scientists, engineers that are really are also, of course, very familiar with different phenomena of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, and flooding.
So you just have to. It's like a checklist of all my place
That's
of
right.
work or my home. It's near this.
Yeah,
so.
you can choose any place of interest, as I said, and the resolution is as high as a Google Earth map, because the base map is a Google Earth map. So you can see the roof of your house, the streets, and even I think the persons walking on the streets.
Sir, can you share your personal tips on preparing for an earthquake or one of these hazards?
Yeah, be observant always. One thing perhaps we were not able to talk about is there's talk, even among scientists, that some claim that there are ways to sort of predict an earthquake by making use of the unusual behavior of animals. I'm not sure if you've heard about that.
Yes.
But still, it's a highly debatable issue among scientists, including us, of course. But just to mention what these claims are, some believe that there are certain types of creatures or animals like cockroaches, the night-dwelling, the dark-dwelling creatures like cockroaches, rats, snakes, who prefer to actually stay in the dark. But when you see them out in the open, like they come out unusually, then it could be a sign that there's an impending earthquake. You can see in literature even that sometime in the 1970s, the Chinese claim that they were able to predict a very strong earthquake somewhere in the inland part of China, continental China, by making use of this technique, observing, and they claim that they were able to save some lives of 1 million people. But as I said, still a very debatable issue, and up to today, it's very difficult to make a link between the behavior of such creatures and the actual occurrence of earthquakes, because those studies have been cited, but it is very rare to see the percentage of success. For example, how many times has this technique been successful? I myself have not seen results of studies like this, because you'll have to, of course, be statistically, the scientific method requires statistical success, meaning if it happens 1 out of 100, then maybe it's not a proper way of predicting, right? So, so personal tips, be always aware and be conscious of where the active faults are. The only problem is the efforts of mapping out these active faults is ongoing. It's a dynamic process. It's changing.
Yes.
Yeah, it's developing, and so it's possible that places where we think there are no faults will eventually in the future will discover some.
Right.
And that's our job, actually. We are fault finders. They call us the fault finders. And then consult the experts if you decide to, especially if it's a place where you will stay the rest of your lives, right? Like your house, your retreat house, or your retirement house, or whatever. You consult the experts. people should not be too worried about the cost of consulting the experts, because there's no, you cannot equate the value of your life
Right.
to the cost of consulting these people. Right? Yeah, I think those are the things that everyone should remember as far as preparing for earthquakes are concerned. Of course, the usual, what we do in drills now, go underneath the table and
Right. Sir, anything else you would like to share, or any of the institute's work that what are you doing right now at the institute?
yeah. There are other projects we are working on with respect to active faults. We are working on one in Panay. Maybe, I don't know if everyone, but anyone wants to know that there's actually an active fault very close to Boracay Island.
Really?
Yes, and there was an earthquake in 1990 that many have forgotten, because
How strong was the earthquake?
7, magnitude 7.
Okay.
It happened in June 14 of 1990. But it was the earthquake of Luzon occurred a month later, July 16, 1990. And people tended to forget, to have forgotten
that
the
happened.
90, because it
Right.
was smaller, farther away, perhaps from Manila. But we visited the place that was destroyed by the earthquake, and you can still see up to now remnants of the ruins, for example, of buildings due to that earthquake. The importance of knowing where these faults are, these places are, is that, yeah, for example, as I said, the development of the entire archipelago is quite fast, meaning but constructing such infrastructure should always take into consideration, not set aside, the possibility that these faults will generate earthquakes again in the future.
Right.
There are many other places in Mindanao, for example. There are also active faults there. And there are big cities like Davao, also in Cebu. By the way, we talked about, I mentioned Negros earthquake and Bohol. So these are the Visayan islands, right? But I have not mentioned the island in between them.
Right.
What's the island between Negros and Bohol? It's Cebu.
Cebu.
Yeah. So there are efforts now also in Cebu to look for active faults.
Right.
Because if it happened in Negros, it happened in Bohol, it's not impossible that it can happen also in Cebu.
Right.
Yeah. And we have teams in UP now, not directly under my laboratory, but other laboratory researchers, they are now working on in Cebu to look for active faults.
Okay.
And we should be doing this all throughout the country, actually. Yes. And that's what the other countries are doing. Taiwan, Japan, of course, they have the resources and everything. But we can also do our share as far as researchers are concerned. Maybe we have to be more efficient in our appeal to government to support scientific research, especially in matters of hazard assessment, because after all, you can build anything you want, but if the potential for hazards to this infrastructure are not taken into consideration, then your infrastructure might go to waste after one event, one earthquake event.
Thank you, sir, for joining us this afternoon.
Anytime, you're welcome. Yes.
We've been speaking to Dr. Mario Aurelio about earthquake hazards in the Philippines. I'm G. Geronimo. Thanks for watching.